Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of the Production Readiness Review meeting, sub-project of SIG Architecture. It is currently Wednesday, May 19th, 2021. And I think we're going to start today with a retrospective for how PRR went for the 122 cycle for enhancements freeze. David, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I went ahead and subbed in good, bad improvements and things that were suggested. So I thought this time going through it after it had been required once before meant that things graduating from beta to GA went much easier. The comments were already there. You had the metrics and you just had to diff the, like, did you actually create the metrics you said you would? And did the feature appear to work with the scaling profile that it claimed it was going to have? But the trip from alpha to beta is like a sheer cliff someone has to climb. We want alpha to be easy in the sense of, like, you don't always know what the characteristics are going to be. You don't know precisely what you can measure. And the threshold is lower, right? You're just starting with it, and so we don't want to make it hard. I think that could be an area where we might be able to make it easier on people trying to move forward.
Is there anything that we could potentially move from beta to GA? Because right now, from what I've seen, like, beta to GA is almost a no-op, whereas, as you've mentioned, alpha to beta is a pretty big jump.
I haven't looked at the questionnaire with that thought in mind. Stuff gets baked pretty hard in beta, right? Like, if you think about it, people, because of the beta guarantees or the beta desired guarantees, right? You shouldn't break an API, for instance. If you miss a scaling consideration in beta, it's difficult to fix.
Does that change if people are going to beta with, like, for example, a feature flag as off by default for whatever reasons? Like, there are a few cases where that's true. For example, if you've got, like, version skew concerns between kubelet and the API server.
Yeah, I think that's the only case where we can think of, like, moving some questions, like, from beta to GA. I think if you have, like, beta, I was looking into and I was thinking about that too, and I think all of the questions are needed as soon as you enable the feature by default.
Yeah, a lot of the questions are focused around, how do I know that this thing is functioning properly, and what are the considerations I have to have for its rollout? And if it's on by default, you kind of need to know what those are.
Yeah. Yeah, for what it's worth, this is maybe a good thing. I have found, at least, because some people had asked me, is the PRR process a bunch of extra paperwork or is it helping? And this was my first review as a PRR approver. And for the most part, I found that the questionnaires were actually really helpful. That in a lot of cases, when I was doing the review, it wasn't just a no-op. Like, I ended up asking people questions, and it either helped them with their designs or helped them think of things that they hadn't thought about when they had initially gone to, like, operationalize their feature. And so while I agree that I think the beta paperwork is probably the biggest jump, I think alpha and GA right now are pretty reasonable in terms of the requested stuff. But at least I did do some beta reviews as well. And I think that it's not unreasonable of us to ask, and it does seem to be helping. So I don't know that we can measure that necessarily yet. I think we're still waiting on data from John's survey, but definitely I thought it was good. And I think I've gotten good feedback from the folks that I was reviewing as well. So
yeah, I had the same feeling. I mean, I've caught a bunch of mostly related to metrics, but not only. Like I also found some issue with at least one, I can't remember, maybe even two, with upgrades procedure that won't really work as we would expect. So I think we are catching real errors. And I've also heard a bunch of like positive feedback from both people that are filling in the PRR, but also from SIG leads that like they are sometimes missing some things, and like the additional PRR review actually makes sense even in their opinion as a second round of review.
yeah, one of the things that I've definitely found on the like metrics and SLO side is a lot of the people going through this process have not thought about that stuff at all. Like they're, developers, they don't really have a concept of what it would be like to, operationalize this or run it in production. And so there's an opportunity to have a conversation like, well, this is what an SLO is, and like, this is how you measure it. And like, what do you want this to be considered like running as normal to mean? And a lot of people don't really think about that. So it gives them an opportunity to be able to think about that and to make sure that there's some defined experience for the people who are going to be running this feature on clusters. Like I had some really interesting conversations with, for example, stuff that like had bypassed the process for alpha and beta because it was too old and was going straight to GA. And I was like, well, how do I know if this is working? And they're like, well, I hadn't really thought about that. So
just as an observer, it seems like there's been a lot of really good substantive conversations that probably wouldn't have happened. But the other added bonus is that you're almost like these like sort of neutral third parties, as opposed to like people who are really like, I just want this cap in. And so I think like the quality of conversation and the things that people have picked up on has just been like a huge sort of value add in the cap process of like having, these like knowledgeable reviewers that aren't like, you're personally invested in like Kubernetes, but you're not personally invested in the cap. And I don't know, I've seen people get a lot of value out of that. And I just wanted to say thanks for all of your work.
Thank you. That's good feedback. I had a question that I struggled with on a couple reviews, particularly for SIG Node, with how strict we want to be with how features expose, whether you know if they're not working, right? Like there are features for kubelets in particular, kubelets and storage are the two that seem to have this trouble, where you get back a, how do I know that it's working? And the answer is, it is exposed in this, run this like XFS quota space command on a node, and you'll know whether it's working or not. And I struggled with that because, sitting as someone who like most of my interaction is at the level of tell a customer to go off and collect something, and I look at that data afterward. My customers don't like the idea of SSH to every single one of your nodes, run this command, and give me back the data.
Well, and furthermore, they might not have access to SSH to the nodes if they're running on a hosted service. So like they might not even be able to run those commands.
there is that part as well. You end up in a spot though where and this came up when I was asking Derek about how some, I don't know, the answer I got back is like it's exposed in some C group status thing, and I was like, Derek, what is this? Can I see this? And what he tells me is that there are often processes that'll sort of fleece that information and then expose it back up. And he referenced C Advisor as a project that would do that, where like yes is located down here, C Advisor will summarize it for you, then you can gather it from C Advisor. And so I asked, is it reasonable to have the person authoring the feature tell me where to find it in C Advisor. And he wasn't as confident in that, right? Because apparently, I guess C Advisor is an optional thing. And I don't actually know.
It's not quite optional right now. It would be very, very hard to split it out. I think at some point we want to get rid of C Advisor, but
Okay.
right now it's in tree. So
okay, well,
like
he
kinda have to
described
run
it as you could have other fleecing agents, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know that I want to reach resolution on it on this call, but it is something I think we should think about. How prescriptive? You just want to say, like, you got to give me at least one example that doesn't require me to SSH to a node. That would sort of be, not a huge bar, but hopefully whoever's developing it would be able to know of at least one example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have an example or like problem with the same category where like there is an extension of a feature, but the original feature is completely unmonitorable and unobservable and not all. Like the example that I had was like from network policies. Like there is no metrics for network policies. No, even network policy API object doesn't even have status field or like struct inside. So there was nothing. So the question is like, how much can we push actually in that situation if someone was just adding a small extension to like network policies or some sub feature, if the bigger feature itself doesn't have anything. So because that effectively means that they need to do, in many cases it would mean that they would have to like add observability to the whole feature. Maybe not all the details, but like they need to like build this whole infrastructure. So there's a question what we want to do with those kind of cases too.
Yeah, I remember that one. I'm not sure. I think I'm going to have to go off and think about that.
Yeah.
The
I think that's something we
options
can.
are not.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the options can be difficult there in both directions.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's something worth following up in another PRR meeting as something to think about. I have a bad
I
thing.
agree with this. I just wanted to bring it. Sorry.
My bad thing is that I think that like more than half of the things that I ended up reviewing for PRR, I didn't even get assigned until the last 2 days. And that made for a very unpleasant Wednesday and Thursday for me. And everything that had been assigned to me sooner than that, I got to in a timely manner. So it was very frustrating for me to like be sitting around waiting and just nothing was assigned, and like a lot of things weren't ready or I hadn't filled out the questionnaire. So I ended up kind of like hitting a bit of a wall in terms of just the amount of workload that got dumped sort of last minute. So like, is it possible for us to say, well, the enhancement freeze is like blah date, but you have to have the PRR like questionnaire filled out like 5 business days before that or something like that?
I mean, I'm not saying anything like officially, but I don't see why not. Like the docs have a deadline for a placeholder PR, and that's just creating a pull request that they make people do. And this seems, I like the one thing that I was going to say as I was listening to you was just because everybody's really late getting their PRRs ready doesn't mean that you have to like personally sacrifice all of your time to review them. So like part of it is like they have to come in at a reasonable time so that reasonable people have a reasonable amount of time to reasonably review them. And so if that's not happening, you don't have to get through them all. But also if it would facilitate it more by having a deadline for the PRRs to facilitate a in-depth solid review, I don't see what the problem would be. Because like it can't be like everybody puts it all in at the last day and then all the PRR reviewers have to scramble to get it in, and then suddenly the whether or not a KEP gets in is like somehow on your shoulders. Like that's not sort of the proper placement of responsibility.
Well, I really didn't want to be the blocking thing for a lot of these KEPs. Like, I don't want to be the one telling them no, especially if, you know, the chairs and the people who are working on them are willing to put in all of this time. So, like, if it's possible to say the PRR deadline, and you have to have, like, some PR in some form open with PRR, whether or not that's, like, the whole KEP update or just the PRR a week before the deadline, if people are okay with that, I think it would be really helpful, because I don't want to have to, like, I mean, I must have done like a dozen plus reviews just on Wednesday. And like, they're not easy reviews. Like, you have to go and read through the entire KEP and think of how all the ways that the feature could potentially break. So I would have much preferred to space that out if I possibly could have.
Well, I'd actually thought about that when I saw it happen, because I was like, well, like for the KEPs, often we see people putting them up at the very last minute. And I'm like, that's cool that you put it up at the last minute, but like there also has to be padding onto whatever your last minute is, because people have to review it as a general matter and you might have to change it and update it. And I think that it's very reasonable, if you think that this is going to facilitate the review work, to have the PRRs in, then I think that that's like a reasonable request to propose.
So I got a question about that. There were a lot of them. Was it worse than last time or better than last time? I don't know, maybe about the same. But did we find them? Did they get assigned in the last couple of days because we didn't find them earlier, or because they weren't available earlier? Right. So I know in some cases, like, you know, there were KEPs that were open like 2 days before a deadline, and they said, "Hey, please review this." Like, oh, you're killing me, man.
It was a combination in my case. A lot of them had been like open, I think, a while before, or had been opted in, but there either was not a PRR update opened, or they had opened the thing but they hadn't filled out PRR. And so when I finally got tagged into review like 2 days before the deadline, I was like, well, you need to fill out the questionnaire. There was a lot of that.
Yeah, so in my case, I think everything that I was doing on Thursday, which were like 6 or 7 examples or something, was either opened within last like 24 hours. So clearly like the last time like opened KEPs even, or KEP updates, it wasn't just PR, it was like really KEPs, or the KEPs that or updates that were opened earlier had one round. Like, I mean, I did one round, but no one looked into like my comments for a week or something. And then suddenly they wake up like a couple hours before deadline, and they they try, and in all cases it was actually wasn't even applying the comments, but were trying to convince me that like all the things are not needed. And actually I had a couple examples where they were explicitly asking also SIG leads that maybe they can confirm that it's really not needed, and maybe we can ignore that. And actually that was one of the things that went pretty well, was that like SIG leads, I had 2 such cases from 2 different SIG leads where like they said, no, like if he is asking for that, like I support that, like those are useful. In both cases it was about metrics actually, or like observability. So that went really well actually, that we have support from the SIGs themselves.
There's also just the side note of, if you're in the, like, just as a personal thing, like if you're in the position where you're like, I want to give this a full review and I don't have the capacity to, or this is going to take more time than what's actually like even left in the release, you could always tell the author, like, I think you're going to have to submit an exception for this so that I can fully review this with enough time. I mean, that would also be a fair request, because like you have to do your role properly. And if you haven't really had the opportunity because these are late breaking things, it's also within the realm of reasonableness to say that. It kind of sucks because that puts the burden on you personally to have to say it and block, which is why potentially a soft deadline would be better. But I'm just throwing that out there, like just as a statement, because I've seen this happen in various forms of like late breaking things, and then other people have to hustle. So the exception thing is always open for that author, and then they can explain in the exception why they didn't have, you know, their stuff up and the PRR done, and ask their SIG for more time and give you more time to properly review it, because we don't want your reviews to be like rushed or incomplete, because then that undermines the whole process.
Does anybody have any objections to asking the release team for the next release to make a PRR questionnaire must be filled out deadline 1 week before the cap freeze?
I think we actually, if we want to do that, I think we should show up to one of their meetings and lay it out and explain what the challenges were. And before we go there, we should try to gather the information about how many came in late. I'm supportive of the idea, but I want to make it an easy question. I want to make it easier for SIG Release to be able to answer that question.
Do you want to volunteer to gather that data? Would you be okay if I action you with that?
Let's think about how we would gather it first. Well, I'm okay. I might need some help figuring out how we would gather it. Like, would we look through every PR merge to enhancements and approved by one of us in the week leading up?
Well, I think we might also want to consider the stuff that got removed from Milestone that we also had been asked to do PRR on and like missed it completely. Because there's a lot of those where it was like, please do PRR. And I look at it like, this is not filled out, so I can't. And then they're like, okay, yeah, there's no way we're going to get this in.
So I actually keep a little diary just of all the ones that I do and the exchanges back and forth and the dates that it happened, just so that there is a should an explanation be of why something didn't make it be necessary. I have it, but I only have mine. Do you guys have a similar list so we could find those?
I think it's fair to ask all of us to maybe go and like, for the things that we reviewed, come up with the list and say like when the PRR questionnaire was actually completed. Like in terms of like maybe when we were assigned, when it was completed, because I think I should be able to find that pretty easily from everything that I was assigned to and approved.
Okay.
Yeah, I think going over like our own PRs might be easier and might scale better.
Okay. Then, well, I guess then I don't actually gather all the data. I only gather like, you know, a quarter of the data. But yeah. I think that's a workable solution because yeah, there is a lot of history. It's hard to find these things, right? Like I have, let's see, what's my oldest number here? I reviewed PR 1116 and we are currently up around number 2700. So like some of these are pretty old.
Well, some of them are also stuck in perma beta. So actually, that raises a question. How are we finding like people migrating some of these older things to like the newer templates? Has that been a source of friction?
It's only come up with, I don't know, maybe a half dozen features. I've been a little bit more generous in cases where someone's like, I created this KEP, but like this is so old, it came from the community repo, and you know, has no formatting and doesn't have the same sections, but it's been on and heavily used for the past 3 years. What should I do? I've been generous to the point of tell me what metrics to look at so I know whether it's working. A best effort of how to turn it off will be good enough, but basically, you know, for stuff like that migrated, I have not been as, I've tried to be accommodating.
And maybe another question around tooling. How did people find like the spreadsheet versus CapCuddle versus other things? Because I was basically only using the spreadsheet. CapCuddle was missing a bunch of things for me.
We've got to fix that tool.
Yeah, I was also using spreadsheet.
I didn't realize that. I was using Cap Control for half of it. I guess I switched over about Tuesday.
Yeah, Tuesday is roughly Tuesday is when actually spreadsheet started working, right? When we got
Well,
permissions.
yeah, and that was part of why I couldn't like do anything until the last minute, because we discovered we've got like, 60 caps and only like 5 of them had been assigned. So I think there were like but
We lost you for the last
oh
10
yeah,
seconds.
sorry. I think I said, I don't know what you got, but I said there were like at least 25 things that were not assigned by the time I went and looked at the spreadsheet. And I had been filling it out based on what had been assigned to me according to CapCuddle, but also like people poking me on IRC, or sorry, on Slack, not IRC.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I really want the Cap Control tool to work. And I guess if I want it to work, I should go in and try to figure out like why it wasn't working. I'll take that as a to-do, but probably on a 2-meeting cycle.
That sounds good. I'm also going to add a note here that everyone was using an old binary that John had lying around because like head was broken.
Do you also potentially want just an extra item to, like, as a backup, have you added to the spreadsheet however you were added this time for the release team? So like if you do hit any CapCuddle like issue, you can kind of pivot over to the spreadsheet and just have that immediately usable.
Well, that's what happened for me, and so we asked them. It ended up being a little bit late that we asked them to add it, and then they added it over the weekend. So we only really had it in the last 4-ish days of the cycle, but it was super helpful.
Well, the spreadsheet is just copied from one release to the next. So whatever is probably in that, if there were like columns or whatever added, are going to be in the next release. And so if there are permissions that you want, it seems like just as a backstop, just have you set up in a spreadsheet. And like, if you don't use it, you don't use it because you're using the tool. But if the tool isn't working, you're already loaded into the spreadsheet so that you can have like a more seamless kind of experience. And we can just make sure that you have permissions for that, I think.
So the
as a backup
was awesome, and there were a bunch of different reasons for that. But some of the things off the top of my head was that it made it really fast for me to be able to filter by anything that got removed from the milestone, anything that did not have PRR approved, because I could set like the PRR approved or not approved, and I could filter by that. None of those things I can currently do in CapCuddle. So I was basically using the spreadsheet exclusively. And all of that was super, super handy and super helpful. So I was very happy that we had that, even if it was late. Let me add that as a good thing in the notes.
Well, it'll be there next time.
I just typed a bunch of stuff. Does anybody else have stuff they want to bring up?
That's it for me. Overall, I thought it went fairly well.
How do we feel about like the structure and process? I know, for example, for myself, this being my sort of first kick at the can, there were a bunch of things that I ended up reviewing that it turned out were out of tree. And so they were kind of they weren't necessarily a NOAA, but PRR was optional. And so that was a cool learning experience where I got to sort of both guide them and was guided myself over the course of their review. I think we now have that sort of clarified, but that might be sort of oral history as opposed to written policy. I don't know if that's written down anywhere, if we want to capture that.
I think it's worth thinking about what that precise guidance would be. There are probably some distinctions based on exactly what out of tree is getting updated. For instance, if someone goes and says, hey, I want to change structured merge diff, right? I'm going to say, yeah, PRR is not optional on that. You have to do it because we include that in our core product. And if I'm going to ship it, I need to have confidence that I can figure out whether it's working or not. So I don't think all out of tree components are equal.
So I would argue in that case it's not out of tree because it's going to get vendored in tree immediately, and presumably we're sticking with the Kubernetes release cycle. The sorts of things I'm thinking of that are like sort of NA out of tree are like SIG instrumentation has some binary, like for example cube state metrics, that's not part of the main repo and is versioned totally separately and like does not follow the Kubernetes release cycle. In those cases I'm just kind of like, it doesn't really apply. There are other things that I think are also a little bit like the lines are blurrier. So Cube ADM was another example where I, in reviewing it, like the only changes were in Cube ADM. None of them were in any of the Kubernetes components. And so even though I think Cube ADM is still developed in the Kubernetes repo, it's kind of considered an out of tree component. So I don't know, maybe we just need better definitions in terms of what is in tree and out of tree, because I know that that is something that's been discussed at the SIG release level.
Where would you like to draw the line on a CSI driver, for instance, right? Like it is out of tree. It is clearly a SIG project. Some, would I say most? No, some have actually written keps about themselves. I have opinions. Should my opinions
Remember if I was the
be
approver,
solicited?
I just looked at it.
Huh?
Oh, sorry, my internet is being bad. Let me see if I can find an example.
Trying to think of whether I saw one this release. This time there was a whole CSI driver provider, which actually I guess technically the whole thing is out of tree. It's for Windows, right? But I think the PRR review for that was helpful because even though it's out of tree, it's going to be there for every Windows, well, for every Windows node that wants to have CSI drivers, it'll be present. I'd like to think about exactly what we want to write down there.
Kirsten had written in the chat that we need more clarity from SIG Arch or SIG. Yeah, do you want to? I put it in the notes.
Because that's a SIG Arch question, and I think that the other thing is that in tree out of tree is also what the release team will track or not. So like if you think that there are things that are out of tree that should be tracked, then I think that that needs to be that's like a totally fair thing to say, but that should be like a broader discussion so that then the release team can properly track things, because that's also like we're not going to spend all our time tracking out of tree enhancements, and like there is a push to kind of move those into eventually some other form. But if you're seeing value in reviewing some of these, then I think that that's like a good discussion to bring up in SIG Arch, potentially enhancements. I guess enhancements, but it feels like a bigger question in a way than just like an enhancement. And then I would just say that as just one small follow-up for some of the PRR process, if so like if you have specific things that you think the release team might be able to assist you with, like if you like when they make a pass through all of the enhancements, if there's a column that you would want them to add to the spreadsheet, it's like, oh, there's not a PRR here, or some sort of like pretty reasonable tracking that that team can do since they make passes through all of the keps as well, like in the very beginning. I would add that to the release team retro doc, and then people will discuss it and then just say like, yeah, we'll do that in the next go round. So like, because there's only 3 or 4 of you, and there's a lot more. There's also these like enhancement shadows and things that are going through these PRs as well. So if there's any support that you need from that team, I would just think about that and add that to the retro doc.
Yeah, I think that would be great. As I said before, I have very good feedback on it. I think the only thing that I would say that was a little confusing is someone had initially populated those columns, and a lot of the stuff that had been populated was wrong. So I spent a bunch of time fixing it. For example, there were things that said they were approved when they were definitely not approved. And some things that were said they were assigned to one person, but were actually assigned to another person, and so on.
Okay.
So,
well, I'll add a placeholder
it was all fixed.
To the retro.
So.
I'll add a placeholder into the retro doc, and then I'll just like link it into this thing, and like you guys can add whatever you want to add to it, just to be discussed on the release team and later.
I just actioned you in the doc. Is there anything else we want to cover? I'm so impressed with our notes. They're so good.
I will find out how good they are when John reads them.
Yeah, we'll find out. I think they're great. I mean, hopefully John will get by with reading the notes and not having to watch us, but in any case, the recording will be there. We did not go over this things suggested section. Do we want to briefly spend some time discussing that? There was a suggestion from Stephen.
Yeah, it's the only one I know of. Stephen asked whether we wanted to mark some caps as not requiring PRR with some sort of marker file in the PRR folder, so that we would have to say, yeah, it doesn't really require it. I think the decision in that Slack thread, I believe you were there, was that it's not that common. And so, you know, if you deal with 2 of them per person per release, it's easy to just say, yep, you're right, you don't need it, and I'll mark it for you. I think that's good enough for my purposes for now.
Yeah, I'd be a -1 to adding more metadata. I'm having a hard enough time getting people to fill out the required stuff, and I am very happy to just approve it's a no-op, because somebody has to go and like look at it to tell it's a no-op to begin with.
Exactly.
And my worry would be that, you know, if we add that as a lever, a bunch of people are going to start putting PRR is not required when it is, and then there won't actually be a review.
Well, then you end up with a whole.
They will 100% do that.
Yeah. So, okay. Just want to make sure that was caught on our list. I don't know of any other suggestions that I saw while we were going through this last week.
Okay. I don't think, do you have anything else, Wojciech?
No, I think that's all.
Cool. I think that's it for the retro then. Is there anything else we want to cover today?
Not for me.
Kirsten,
and I'd want to give
anything?
John a shot probably for most other topics.
Yeah, hopefully John can come back and sort of asynchronously like add +1s or any additional details, since he didn't get a chance to join today. Okay, well, it sounds like we don't have anything else, so I am very happy to give everybody 13 minutes back.
All right. Talk to you guys later.